I'm here to talk to you about social enterprise. I'm using the term social enterprise, but many of you may have known it for decades, really, in New Zealand as community enterprise. Social enterprise is also community enterprise, but it's a broader concept, and I'm just going to give you a bit of a grounding in how we look at that. It's not a fad, it's a real international movement. In the UK alone, depending on what numbers you look at, there's between 42 and 68,000 of them. So we did a lot of this grounding yesterday, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I like this diagram because it explains that climate change is not a thing of the future. Since the last century, incidents of weather-related natural disasters have increased by 1,000%. In this 90 days, 123 records were broken in Australia in terms of climate. And this was covered with great eloquence yesterday as well about the global monetary system and how it is geared towards making the wealthy wealthier. The wealthiest 67 people globally have the equivalent wealth of the least rich 3.5 billion. That means if you're in the first group here, you have an average of about $20 billion worth of wealth. If you're in the second group, you have about $486 worth of wealth. That's not just an international statistic. This is a diagram from New Zealand to show you the wealth disparity. Here. That bottom line there is the wealth of the lowest 50% of the population. This one shows you how that is represented geographically. This is the New Zealand Deprivation Index. This is an index which doesn't just look at income, but also looks at indicators of poverty, including unemployment, benefit use, ability to buy food, fresh food, indicators like feeling cold because you don't want to put the heating on because it's going to cost you too much, even how much people use food banks, and cost of clothing, whether they're clothing. So this has knock-on effects, this income disparity, poverty, including, as was touched on yesterday afternoon, youth, particularly unemployment with young people. Just reflecting back some of the things that I've heard said about the local community. I looked it up yesterday, and in the far north, youth unemployment is about 22%. Just 1 in 5 will start out their working lives without employment. And the impact of that can be lifelong. So this is the model that we use to explain the place we want to be. The light green circle is the just and fair place for us to live. The center is the social fabric, the infrastructure that we need to live. And that can be personal well-being, but community well-being as well. So we want to have that infrastructure. We want to live in a place where that's in place. But we also need to live within the means that the planet can provide us. Again, so eloquently described yesterday. What I'm going to talk about today is organizations that have set themselves up to operate within these realms. Again, yesterday, Ubi was mentioned by Lawrence. Ubi is a good example of an organization which was set up with a mission to interrupt the food system, with an aim to move 15% of the spend in supermarkets into the local economy, local growers. It's a really simple principle, that is that there's local growers, And if they can find local customers easily, then there will be more of it. So they provide a company which will provide and deliver food boxes directly to your door, which are all organic and locally produced. They do that at a price which is lower, in most cases, than the supermarket purchase price. So it's a good example of doing it differently. It's a company, but it's a not-for-profit company. It doesn't distribute wealth. Another example is Tfangai Trust, based in the Waikato. They have tree nurseries and a farm, and they provide employment training opportunities for those that have been long-term unemployed and are ex-offenders. So they have a 26-week program. They provide training for 100 trainees per year. About half of their turnover is through sales of trees. So they're operating in a trading model. It's not a charity, but they have charitable aims. So a further 25% of that is through government contracts, and a further 25% of that is covered by philanthropic grants. They only go for philanthropic grants to try and provide extra time in their training program because they're working with people with really complex needs. About 80% have drug and alcohol problems, so it takes a while for them to get into the working environment. So these examples are just broadly light touch, but they're a demonstration that there's a new type of organization. Actually, they've been around for a while, but there's a new name for them and a new intent to create organizations which don't maximize wealth, income to private owners as a kind of private business model. And they don't want to be charities. They don't want to be reliant on raising money to spend it for social good. They're using hybrid models. That is, that they set themselves up to trade and have business, but have charitable aims. When I say charitable aims, I mean that they have a mission, a purpose, which is social or environmental. They've got certain characteristics. It's not a legal form, it's not a legal entity. Actually, many social enterprises just set up in a way which is most pragmatic for them. They could be a co-op, they could be a charitable trust, they could have a private company and a charitable trust. Often they're quite complex, but it's not one single model. But they do have common characteristics, which is that the first one being that their purpose is the primary reason they exist in the first place. They set up to achieve a mission. They also set it up so that it's actually embedded in their governing documents and in all of the management decisions that they make. It's not an add-on. It's not socially responsible business. They're in the business to achieve this mission. Quite often that's also reflected in ownership, so community ownership in particular. We think of them as organizations rather than activities, and they trade, most importantly. They're not donor-driven. So they operate in markets, they produce products and services, they compete. One of the important things about this is that a purely philanthropic model, although really important for many things, actually can be quite short-term, which is that people will raise funds and then spend them to achieve it. And they're finite funds and they can be used once. And then they have to go and find more. Social enterprise invests in a model which will be able to self-perpetuate. That's why you invest in creating a business which can trade into markets to generate income to fulfill itself. And that's also why many of them don't distribute profit, because the profit just goes back in to further achieve their mission. So some of the advantages, well, they're regenerative. They're kind of embedded from where they come. They have a mission to achieve. They are economic. They require some sort of economy to make them run. They are empowering and inclusive because by their very nature, they do tend to be kind of co-production models. The people that make them work are the community. And particularly with community ownership, you know, it's not distributing wealth to those that had wealth in the first place. So that's a bit of the theory, and I said I wouldn't concentrate on theory. But I just want to say, in terms of the social enterprise term, it looks like a lot of different things, and that's why it can be a bit hard to grapple with. Community enterprise is one of those forms, and community enterprise is a social enterprise that is based in its community, and it's there to serve the community. And that could be a place, a location, but it could also be a population of people. Social business startups look more corporate, but they start from the very start with a social mission. So they're just not place-based. They might grow. So Ubi's a good example of that. You know, Ubi has a system which they're going to grow internationally. They're in Sydney and they're in the US. So although a community can use them for community benefit, Ubi itself actually is a kind of international business, or will be. Transitioning not-for-profits is another really, it's a more complex area, but often charities are looking to trade to try to become more sustainable because they find constantly looking for funding can be quite distracting from what they actually want to do. Joint ventures is a new one that we're seeing, which is large corporates kind of unable to satisfy their own kind of social and environmental responsibilities, and so joining up with community groups, community organisations, not-for-profits, to have joint ventures to do that. We're currently working with New Zealand Post, who have produce a large surplus of uniforms each year, right? That's a problem for them. And rather than try to solve that on their own, they're going to work with community groups to look at that waste product as an asset. So they're just, you know, lots of different ways that can be looked at. We see there's common themes that we're seeing, and this is kind of quite light, but assets in the community is a really big one. Productive assets, non-productive assets, buildings, you know, so space in colleges. How can we use that? How can we sustain that? Services to community, so community enterprises are actually providing the services in the community. CBEC's a great example of that, providing waste management as one of many. Growing opportunities as well, so actually producing employment opportunities and generating income from out with the local community. And the other one is social investment, which is a kind of hot topic at the moment, which is a recognition that in order to set up a social enterprise, you need capital, but you don't necessarily want to be giving up ownership for that capital. And you don't necessarily want it to be affecting the model in terms of, you know, if your finance is too expensive, the model might not work. You're not going to be distributing profit off it. So it's just a nuanced thing. What I'm going to start with is an example which is close to my home. I promise I won't stay in Scotland. There's lots of good social enterprise examples in New Zealand. But the reason I picked this is it's an island. It's an example of, I'm going to talk about Gia. Has anyone heard of Gia? Great. You been there? Or, yeah. Sorry? Oh, brilliant. When you come. So Gia's an island. I show it on the map because as the crow flies, it's not very far from Glasgow, but it's on the other side of a peninsula, so to travel to it takes about 3.5 hours from Glasgow. And it's beautiful, but it's very small. So I'm going to give you a wee introduction to Gia. So one of the things that people don't necessarily know about Scotland is it's got one of the most inequitable land ownership in the Western world. That means that large tracts of land are owned by individuals. Gia was one of the examples of that. So they're all tenants. They may have lived there for generations and generations, but they're tenants of that land. And that brought lots of problems. So in 2001, after 7 absentee landlords in 20 years, the islanders came home after work one day to find eviction notices on their houses because the landowner had gone into liquidation. So their island was put up for sale. So after years of underinvestment in the community, the population had dropped from a peak in the 18th century of about 600 down to less than 100. And when the island came up for sale, there had been one example of a land buyout by population in Scotland, and so they seized on the opportunity. Within 7 weeks, they turned around a feasibility study for purchase of the land. And they had a ballot, and 80% of the population voted to purchase. So they created a trust and they bought the island. So there was a £4 million price tag on that, and about £2.5 million was provided by grants from government. Redistribution of land is now a public policy. They got a loan for £1 million of it, and then they raised £500,000 of it, which proportionately doesn't seem a lot, but for less than 100 people seems like quite a significant sum. What they did was they chose not to parcel it up and sell it to the families. They chose to maintain it as land for the trust, and they repaid their loan by selling the manor house. That's what they did. So it's now owned and controlled by the community. Community elects the board. They have a hotel, which they operate. They have farms. They have done collective negotiation with to ship their milk off the island collectively. They now also have a wind farm. They purchase second-hand wind turbines. Purely commercial venture. They got loan finance for it. They sell electricity back to the grid. They also worked in partnership with a social housing provider that put 12 houses on the island, and they ensured that all of the work was carried out by builders on the island. So the population has grown since then by 50%. Significant for a small island like that. And part of the reason why they've attracted new residents is the sense of control and ownership. You're actually joining a community that you can have some control over. You literally can vote for it. That's why I chose that example. It's just a really nice example of a very, very small community that have managed to do incredible things whilst being remote with a bit of ambition. I'm sure if they were standing here, they would tell you all of the things that were hard in that process. It's very easy for me to tell you in retrospect. It worked well. So the local example in New Zealand is Blueskin Energy, who are working to create a collectively owned wind turbine. Again, the aim is local development for this project. So there's no precedent of this. So Blueskin Energy it's a long track to create new ways of doing things. Akina is supporting them through it. It's another UK example, but it's I've chosen this because it specifically looks at kind of youth skills, youth unemployment. This is an enterprise that I worked in Lincolnshire, in England. It's about 7 miles outside of Lincoln, which is the local city, and it's based in a woodland, a very small, 300-year-old woodland. It was purchased by a couple who just wanted to live in the woods. That was their ambition. But it had been extracted all its useful timber, and had been left to its own devices. So invasive species, rhododendron is really invasive into woodland in the UK, and it was covered in rhododendron. It just knocks out the whole ecosystem on the woodland floor. And this couple wanted to restore this to become a community asset. It had been privately owned. And so they hit upon the idea of using the woodland itself as a place for learning. And initially that was, they supported unemployment programs. And that evolved into a specialisation with working with youth. So through a lot of this work, a lot of this community work, they restored the woodland and enhanced it back to a healthy ecosystem. It now provides alternative education for young people from Lincoln, primarily the estates in Lincoln. Many of the young people that come to this have never been in the woodland. They've barely been in the countryside. So actually, there's genuine fear of walking into a space like this, which is quiet and detached, and then noisy when you start listening. This was one of our rangers just sitting with a young person. It's just a really healthy environment for people to sit in. And so alternative education, these are kids from the local community who have been excluded from mainstream education because they are the hardest to deal with. And even with the programs that we were working with, we were receiving the hardest to work with. So we would get from 14 to 16, were the youngest that would come here, and this was school for them. So there were strawberry buildings, which all of the learners had helped to build, and they would get maths, English, ICT, and the rest of the time they were in the woods, learning about looking after things. So that also then evolved into employment training for young people that were not in education employment training between 16 and 19. Actually, much harder to reach that group. But the business model, the income model, was that about half or 3/4 of the income was coming from educational contracts. The wood was also providing the land management services for the district council. So it wasn't just reliant on one source of income. So now the business has land management contracts. It does eco-design consultancy because they worked with a local university to come up with an eco-community hall which sits in the wood. It's a rammed earth, this is the building in the corner, rammed earth building with a double reciprocal beam roof. All of the materials from the county. They also got gifted another woodland as part of a resource consent for a local stone quarry, who again, they need to get resource consent. One of the ways they could assist to do that was to say that they would hand over some of the non-productive woodland land to Hill Holt Wood. And it is now a mental health service for those that are recovering from mental health challenges. They'll come again to the woodland, look after the woodland, restore it. It also has a really healthy eco-burial business, which is one of the other income streams. So the method of operating, looking for contracts to set up and operate and sustain itself, means that by its very nature, it's pretty creative about how it does it, and looks for all of the benefits that can be kind of extracted from one activity. And this all started out of what was not just not an asset, but was actually something which people looked on as something which would be a drain on your resources, which was a scrap of useless woodland. So it looks at community assets in a very broad term, and then looks all the creative ways that it can, build and sustain. Seebeck is your local example. I'm not going to go into too much detail because Cliff's here, and that would be embarrassing. But he'll be on panel. So some really good examples of how community enterprises can provide the local services for your community, and in doing so, provide more opportunity. So because they're not extracting the value, they're not taking out profit to distribute somewhere else, they can put that into growing more opportunities. We were having a good conversation about that last night. I'm just going to give you just a couple more examples and then move on to what Akina does before panel. I wanted to talk about Specialistern, which is an international model, but this is again about looking at assets in your community. This was started by a guy who had a teenage son that was leaving school, and he was on the autistic spectrum, and his massive frustration that there wasn't any really good employment opportunities for his son, with a kind of acknowledgement that his son's condition provided challenges, but also he just thought this guy, he's just the brightest, cleverest guy with particular talents, and there's nowhere for him to fit in the work market. So he created a business. And it's a business consultancy that specializes in software systems, data cleansing. It's software testing, technical things, and it's a business which is built around the talents of people that are on the autistic spectrum, which is just high levels of concentration, real attention to detail, real compliance with rules and how they work, just very, very applicable to this particular type of model. So what he, again, looked at something which looked like a deficit, but actually is an asset when you look at it like this. And this Specialistern is now in 12 countries around the world. So another local example in New Zealand, based in Christchurch, and this is about how they've grown opportunities locally. This is based in Christchurch. It's part of Pathways charitable group. Has anyone heard of it? We have one up there. Oh, there's one, great. They kind of fly below the radar, but they're really one of the best examples of how social enterprise can be pretty challenging, but can work really beautifully, almost by accident. So it was started by 3 guys, Mike, Murray, and Victor, who, as part of their church group, spent a lot of time in Cathedral Square providing meals to homeless people locally. And after about a year, what they realised was that they were providing the same meals to the same people a year later, and felt like they weren't actually interrupting or addressing the problem. And so they set upon the idea of starting a business that would employ local ex-offenders and homeless people. And they got a friendly investor to give them an interest-free loan for $50,000, and they bought a chair manufacturing business. And they very quickly discovered it was not a good chair manufacturing business. It had one product, which was a sort of folding chair, one of these metal. And they also found out that in making these chairs, the type of trainee that they had was not well suited to a high level of productive manufacturing. So they kind of reassessed, right? And they were like, well, to rescue this business, we're going to have to take the trainees out of it and just look after that business, right? So they did that, and they were like, oh. So through connections, they found that there was a local opportunity for de-vanning, so taking stuff off containers. And so they shifted their trainees to that business, and then they transitioned their chair business into a chair business, because they realized that they couldn't actually achieve their mission through that. But if it was profitable, it could subsidize other things. So sort of 15 years later, right? It's always a sort of hazy jump forward in the future until it works, right? So they have 2 businesses and 2 kind of social service entities. They have their de-vanning service, which provides employment opportunities for people that are primarily ex-offenders. That kind of breaks even, right? So they say, if we can provide these employment opportunities and it breaks even, we're doing our job. Great. They have a chair manufacturing business which went from one chair to kind of installing stuff like this. One of their primary markets now is the US. So they broadened their range of chairs, they broadened their market, but the people in it just look after that business. So figures, the alloy fold business has about 4 million turnover. It's wholly owned by the charity and contributes about $360,000 per year to their social programs. It doesn't cover all of their social programs, but what it does allow them to do is it makes their organization more robust because they're not so reliant on their social programs and their philanthropic. Their de-vanning service turns over about 2 million a year. And then they have a retreat, which is the first port of call for those that come out of prison. So it's based in the land, they learn how to grow. They gradually re-enter the community outside of prison and start to build the connections, which are the personal connections, which are the things which will prevent them from re-offending. To actually build that personal infrastructure, that social capital, which helps to solve the problem. And so what they now find is that the ex-offenders come out of prison, they spend time at the retreat, they learn basic skills, and then they go into the de-vanning service as employment. So one completely commercial to give them some freedom for income, one kind of breaking even, in the middle, which just serves its purpose by operating, and then one at the end, which is, it's purely social. It's not going to generate enough income to cover itself, but they're comfortable with that because they know that it's one of the essential parts of that chain. So, like I said, hidden gem in Christchurch, loads of learning to get from there. Particularly the fact that what they started out to do wasn't at all what they ended up with. Just lots of rapid learning, How am I doing for time? 40, okay. That's not bad, actually. I'm quite surprised by that. So in terms of growing opportunities, I just want to touch on one other thing, which is, again, back in the UK. But I spent about 4 years working with community enterprises around Scotland. And what the statistics show, and what our experience showed, was that community enterprises are embedded in our community because that's why they exist, but they were often producing really high quality product, but they were generally selling it to their local community. So, and most of them are concentrated in highly kind of deprived areas. What they really needed to do was to generate more income into the economy, into their local economy, so to reach broader markets. Now, so part of my job was to go out to very small communities in rural Scotland, which were ex-coalfield communities. They'd been created around a mine, then the mine closed, and they all just were left there. But they don't want to leave because it's home. So they have to create their own community assets. They have to run their own community assets. And then, they're producing products, but if they only sell to their local market, that's not going to increase the income into the community. So, we were going to all these little communities and finding these great products, and we were buying them, but that wasn't going to solve the problem either. So we created an online platform which collates lovely products from social enterprises across the UK to sell to a broader market. And I only refer to this because it shows the diversity of product that can be, and it's another strategy, right, to produce kind of high value products. And on this site, there's about 600 products from about 33 producers. It's just another example. So I'm going to skip over that because it's less important. But I'm going to talk to you now just for 5 minutes about Akina Foundation, about what we do. The reason we exist is that this creation of social enterprise is hard. Many of the models are trailblazing. They haven't existed before. So every step is a closed door which needs to be opened, right? Sometimes by force. But So it can be a hard journey. Blueskin's an example of that. It's just going to take a long time before it's established. But once it is established, it provides an example, a model that can be replicated across New Zealand. So trailblazing is hard, right? So we help to get alongside organizations because it's hard. The other thing is accelerated learning, which is that there are people in communities around New Zealand doing this. They're doing it at the same time and they're doing it on their own. So by making connections, we can just share learning. So I can't tell you how many people I send to Christchurch to go and see Pathways Group, because it's a great example of learning. And it might just shortcut the process for other communities. Complexity is another thing. So running and operating a successful social enterprise is difficult because you're constantly weighing up the social and environmental benefit versus the trading and economic. And that's just a permanent tension. So it's a new way of having to learn how to run an organization. So it can be complex. And the last one is undercapitalization, which just means that it's hard to get private equity because they're not going to get a return on it. And then the alternative is to grow organically. And to grow organically, it still means you're pretty lean. So there's a lot of work up front to set up something which in the end will be financially sustainable. But in the first instance, they tend to be undercapitalized because they can't just throw money at it. So this is Akina's vision for a sustainable, prosperous, and inclusive world. The word prosperous in there means is in its broadest term, where we all prosper. And we're assisting to deliver the next generation of transformational social enterprises in New Zealand. We're doing that in three main ways. One is to kind of build and support talent awareness and capability, to support individual enterprises through some of the tricky times of development, and then also just to help facilitate the markets and the investment which are required to make them work. And this is how our model works. So we can provide direct support from our team. I'm a venture manager. It's one of the things I do. Norman Smith, who's about to speak to you in a minute, he's another one. All with some different expertise. We have a thing called a Compass Network, which is a network of corporate pro bono support providers who will help to broker support into an organization. Just to get some more skills, capital capacity in there. Seed funding, I will emphasize this is a very small part of what we do. And it's targeted at those organizations that we have a long-term relationship with and we've done a lot of due diligence with and we sit alongside. And it tends to be just to solve an immediate problem. So if an organization's here and they need to get here and the difference of that is a small amount of money, we're going to provide that small amount of money, subject to our committee. And the other thing is just networks and partnership, right? So this is like me talking to you, and me talking to you after this, and me telling you about other places. Simple but powerful. So these are the services that we have. One of the things that we do is run workshops and clinics around the country. We don't have one planned for this area yet, but we want to come here. So come and chat to me if you want to come and attend something. They tend to be about half a day. It's around social enterprise and building social enterprise business models. And then we have advisory services where we get alongside an organization and provide a dedicated piece of work. Then there's two main programs that we run. One is the Accelerator, which we call the Launchpad. There's some flyers over there. This is for early stage social enterprise ideas. It's a 6-month intensive support process where we'll coach through the startup process to get at the end of that something which is fully formed and hopefully primed for investment. And then we'll also work with philanthropic and private investors who have an interest in social impact investing, so investing in social enterprises along that process. So at the end of it, hopefully there'll be a source of finance for those well-formed, tested ideas. And then incubator is we get alongside an organisation for between a year and 3 years at the early stage of their establishment where they're still a bit fragile. So they're operating, but they're still at early stages and haven't quite reached that sustainability point yet, with an acknowledgement that that's pretty hard. So we try and do that. So the Accelerator has 10 places nationally, and the incubator is about 12 to 15 nationally. So we're concentrating resources on a small number of organisations that, if they work, will not only have fantastic impact on their local community or the community that they're serving, but will also serve as examples that can be rolled out across the rest of the country. That's pictures of the things we do. What I will say is, if you're interested and you have an early stage social enterprise idea, the closing for the launchpad is on the 29th of this month. It's a pretty short application process. You can put in any form that you want. So it could be written, it could be a video, it could be whatever. It just has to answer some really specific questions on our website. Grab me later on if you're interested. I'm very happy to talk to you about it. These are the people that support us? Right, that's me. Thank you very much, by the way. It's just one last thing is that I'm here primarily to learn what's happening in the region, because Akina needs to design programs which kind of really help and support social enterprise around New Zealand. So I'm interested in what you're trying to do, what challenges you're having. So even if these immediate programs are not suitable for you, still come and talk to me about what you're doing so that I can feed that back, and we can hopefully in the future do stuff which is going to support social enterprise more broadly.